It's Mr. P again with lesson number 7, video number 7. And you can see in this video that we are looking at the topic of the Great Migration. Now, I've put that in single quotes because at the end of this video, I'm going to ask that you consider whether this is the most appropriate name and whether you should, whether you want to revise that name. Now, if you're in my honors class, you have a reading that I'm assigning you connected to this series of lessons from Carol Anderson, who did some tremendous research on white backlash. I already, kind of made that text available, the Reconstruction chapter available to you for the debate. I'm going to be assigning you her chapter 2. So that's for my honors class. If anyone in my other classes wants access to that, just email me. I'm happy to send you and share with you PDFs of her scanned in copies of her chapters. But otherwise, I'm going to give you an overview of this time period in this video. So the Great Migration, just some facts, right? Relocation of more than 6 million Black folks from the rural South to the cities of the North and the Midwest, and to some degree the West as well, during the time period from, some sources will cite 1916 as kind of the real kind of peak, but before that, folks were beginning to move as well. So the first period usually is identified as 1910 to 1940, and then 1940 to 1970 is sort of the second leg of the Great Migration. It's important to note that there's a reverse migration happening where Black folks are actually moving back down south during this time period right now. So in 1910, 90% of Black people lived in the South. Excuse me. I believe it's over 3/4 of them lived in rural areas. By 1970, less than 50% of Black people lived in the South. More than half of Black people lived in the North or Midwest or West. And we get less than 25% of Black folks who did live in the South were living in rural parts. So this is a massive change in where Black people are living. They're living now in cities, in the North, in the Midwest, and to some degree, some folks migrate from the rural areas to the cities of the South, Birmingham, Atlanta, New Orleans. All right, so we see Black migration patterns on this map here. This map only looks at 1910 to 1920, but even here, you can just see which cities, the largest circles are the cities that grow the most. You can see Philadelphia, Baltimore, New York, Washington, D.C., Chicago are growing tremendously. New Orleans, right? Atlanta, Birmingham, I mentioned, some of these other cities grow as well. I added a line from Florida because folks are moving from Florida too. This map didn't recognize that, okay? For more information, optional reading, you can go to the Smithsonian magazine and read more about the legacy of the Great Migration. What I love about that article is that it recognizes that in many ways the children of the Great Migration become some of our most recognized actors and artists. This is going to lead us up to the Harlem Renaissance, right? Remember James Earl Jones, who read us the Frederick Douglass 4th of July speech? Here's he as a kid. He, as a child, moved with his family to the North during the Great Migration. This is Zora Neale Hurston, who wrote Their Eyes Are Watching God and was a journalist, an anthropologist, and really important Black woman leader at the time, novelist and journalist. At the time, she is part of the Great Migration as well. So during this time period, there's a lot of people who end up moving to the North, and there's more of those detailed stories in that article there. So you can read that if you're interested. I just want us to recognize both the push and pull factors. When we talk about migratory patterns, migration, people moving, we identify two things, right? Push factors, why do people want to leave where they're at? And pull, why do they go to where they go? So push factors, that's basically the last several videos we've been doing. The degree of violence, of terror, of lynching and mass lynchings pushed people to the North. Now, we also want to recognize that lynchings in the North occurred, right? And part of that is because Black people moved to the North, and then white people all of a sudden become, a little bit more racist in their response to that movement. Nevertheless, the degree of terror in the South was so bad, and the violence was so bad in the South, that people moved to the North, right, and the Midwest, and to some degree the West. The other reason is due to limited jobs in the South, the sharecropping and peonage systems in the South, the debt kind of slavery that existed in the South, and the way in which Black folks were restricted from purchasing, land and that kind of thing was another push factor. And the pull factor was during World War I, during, that period in the that's why 1916 is considered the starting point, is that the U.S. involvement in World War I leads to an increase in demand for factory jobs in the North, where most of the factory industry was. And so they actually come down South to recruit Black workers to come to the North. So that's the pull factor here. This is something that Carol Anderson focuses on in her chapter in her book called White Rage, which is that white Southerners really, really try to stop Black people from fleeing North. This is a part of the story of the Great Migration I only recently learned this year, this summer, to be honest. And what we end up seeing is two big ways in which white Southern, and this isn't, this is like lawyers and politicians and leaders in the South who do two things. They try to prevent trains from leaving, and they threatened railroad companies with lawsuits if they allow Black folks to leave. So they actually would go to tracks and get the trains to stop to prevent people from fleeing. They also passed laws and enforced chain gang prison sentences for anybody, and this would mostly be Northerners, coming down South to recruit Black people to work in the North. Black folks were at risk of, being dragged out of these train stations and being brought back to their places of work. So sometimes they would often kind of dress in a way that tried to kind of show, they might just be, going to work, but then they would, have multiple layers of clothes as a way to kind of like, kind of hide where they were really going. So, they would be dressed for work and pretend to be going for work, and then they'd actually go to a train station. So that happened a lot here. And so the white backlash is a really important part of this story. Okay. And during this time, Black newspapers were crucial in getting people information. Which train stations they should get to, where to get jobs in the North, right? Black newspapers like the Chicago Defender and others were really crucial in that effort. So the last part of this video I want us to look at is the Migration series by Jacob Lawrence. So Jacob Lawrence was a Harlem Renaissance artist. Some of you might choose him for your creative assignment. He was a Harlem Renaissance artist who did a series of pieces known as the Migration series. And I want us to ask the question of, what can we learn about this time period from this series? Okay. While I'm mentioning that, I was just kind of trying to find a piece of information I wanted to share with you about the Great Migration. Right. So here's the quote about how they would dress. So let me just share with you this quote, and then we'll get back to the Migration series. So referring to Black folks, they hid their Sunday best beneath their work clothes so as not to tip off their employers that they were leaving that night. They abandoned their tools in the fields and even their final paychecks to avoid alerting their bosses to their escape plans. They hitched rides on freight trains. They scoured the Chicago Defender for information on housing and jobs. All told, the Great Migration moved nearly 10% of the Black population out of the South. That number is only referring to the first couple decades of the Great Migration. It's even more than that when you go all the way up to 1970. Okay, so that is just the emphasis on the extent to which Black folks had to hide leaving because white employers would come and drag them out of train stations and things like that. All right, so let's look at the migration series. So we see here Jacob Lawrence. He died about 20 years ago in the year 2000. So, a lot of and he has actually become the most expensive Black artist. His work sells in the millions of dollars at this point. So really, really successful artist. All right, so we're seeing folks moving, right, getting their stuff and leaving. But we're going to study the first set of paintings. Helps us learn a little bit about push factors at the time. And if we were in class, we would do some pair sharing and some analysis of this. So if you want to pause and kind of think, read about this draw some conclusions about these pieces on your own, feel free to do that. But here we notice some push factors, right? So we notice Black folks in fields collecting a harvest. So one of the push factors, right, is working for white landowners and barely profiting, right? 20% of all sharecroppers, white and Black, did not earn a single piece of income or profit while sharecropping. It kept them in debt often, and it kept them working for white landowners. So that's a push factor. A reference to lynching here, the violence, the white terror that was a push factor in people fleeing terror. The segregated justice system that, basically, even when Black folks did go to court, they weren't necessarily given their full rights and fair trials with white judges and white juries. We also learn about the Black experience in the North from his migration series. So, segregated schooling. We see the experience of schooling in the North is still segregated. We do see, Black folks have successes. This painting shows a Black doctor treating a Black patient. We see Black folks occupy professional, middle class space. But we see the continued challenges, right? You see this image here. You want to think about, well, how does a set of stairs, notice the perspective, right? It's narrowing, it's stairs, you have to climb them. What might that represent about the Black experience in the North? You want to ask yourself, and the door is, closed there too. So the need, the North, just like we learned in Harriet Jacobs, right? Continued themes here. Not a space of full freedom. The struggle continues, right? The climb towards racial equity continues. That's part of the message I think Jacob Lawrence is conveying in that middle painting. We see, right, a series of Black children sleeping in beds here, and so overcrowded housing. And we see Jim Crow segregation in restaurants and whatnot in the North too. And so the Black experience is not necessarily that is not a full experience of freedom. Okay. And there's a story at the end of the Carol Anderson text, which I'll just preview here. And if you're, honors class, you'll be reading it. If anyone else wants to read it, just email me. It's a story about how in Chicago, a Black doctor moves into a white neighborhood and is basically threatened by a white mob, and the police end up the police end up siding with the white mob, saying there was never even a white mob. He has folks who defend him and a lawyer who defends him. And while he ultimately, after a series of trials, because the first was a hung jury, ultimately he's acquitted. It's important to recognize he did serve time. His family, his wife, served time too. They were arrested. And so in a space where, because the thing is here, they armed themselves to defend themselves when the white mob formed. And so who gets put on trial in these types of instances in the North? It's Black folks who are put on trial, which is part of what he's conveying here too. This is an image that I think tells us something about push factors as well as the experience in the North too, right? That when Black folks were put, went to were able to testify oftentimes they weren't treated fairly. And yet he does win the case. That is important to recognize, that Dr. Ossian Sweet does win his case, yet it's not fully secured here.